Okay, so it's August 4th, 2022, and the big story today is Amnesty International. Now, Amnesty International released a report today that has kind of had this ripple effect of what's going on. I'm going to talk about where the fighting is as a backdrop. And if you're not familiar with me, my name is Darren Gertis. I'm just a professor who is following what's going on very carefully in Ukraine. I wrote a book about Zelensky, and I'm updating it weekly as I put out these daily overviews. So I'm going to go through my daily overview with this as the focus. Okay, so here we go. Amnesty International first is a global movement of more than 10 million people who take injustice personally. We're campaigning for a world where human rights are enjoyed by all. Now, how you define human rights and how you focus on human rights is half the battle. Before I come back to Amnesty International, and I will, I promise, very shortly, I want to talk about what's actually going on the ground, fighting. So, for example, powerful explosion sounded in Mykolaiv. This is Interfact Ukraine. This is Radio Free Europe talking about all the places where there's been fighting in Eastern Donetsk. So many wounded overnight. The governor of Sumy region talked about how there had been shelling. Zitsvitsky, by the way, forgive my pronunciation. I'm an American. I'm not Ukrainian at all. I have no ability to, or special ability to be speaking Ukrainian in this community. The mayor of Nikyapol talked about shelling and a woman was wounded. Russian military also shelled Zikorsky district in the Dnipro region. I'm not trying to be funny. I just can't pronounce these things. So look at all these places where there's been shelling overnight and you see a map with it. Okay. Now there's all this shelling, but there's also a new fighting defensive line. Like we knew about the east and Donetsk, and that's been going, and the Russians have been steadily making little incremental gains in ground. But the new battle lines are in the south. Long convoys of Russian military trucks, tanks, and towed artillery and other weapons are moving away from Donbass, that's in the east, toward the southwest. Bridges, ammunition depots, and rail links are being targeted with growing frequency, and that's what I've talked about over the last few days. Russia's war on Ukraine is about to enter a new phase, a 350-kilometer front line, by the way, for Americans. A kilometer is about 6/10 of a mile. Front lines is stretching southwest from Zaporizhia to Kherson, paralleling the Dnieper River. Okay. Peter Zwak, a retired U.S. Army general who served as a defense attaché for the U.S. Embassy, said, "Look, the fight is in the South is existential. Like you have to win it, you have to win it, or it's all over." So it's a big deal to the Ukrainians. In the south, however, for weeks, Ukraine's forces have made small incremental gains in the Kherson region, which straddles the Dnieper River, and let me scroll down. Russia is dangerously close to blocking the entirety of Ukraine's coastline. Now, that's really important because if the Russians can keep moving a little bit west toward Odessa, just a little bit, Ukraine will be landlocked. They won't be able to get their cargo out by sea. They'll be, ironically, the Russians have wanted to pull Ukraine into their orbit. They'll be more dependent on the West than ever because they will be landlocked, but they'll lose all the mineral rights in the Black Sea as well as be surrounded on three sides. And it's bad. Russian officials have signaled plans to hold referendums in the two regions with an eye toward annexing them. And they've annexed Crimea in the past, and they'll probably annex more if they can get away with it. Okay, so that's what's going on the ground in fighting. So with this as a backdrop, let's talk about, before we talk about Amnesty International, there was this brilliant article in Al Jazeera. Now, by the way, if you don't know me, I triangulate, right? We'll read RT, we'll read Al Jazeera, we'll read The Guardian, we'll read what we have here? Radio Free Europe. We'll read Interfact Ukraine. We'll go through a bunch of different things. Now, Al Jazeera does a great job of actually collating all the things that are happening in each day. They do it. The Guardian does it. The New York Times. And so I try to get bits and pieces of things from different places. But this article, which came out today, talks about the Western media and its war and the war on truth in Ukraine. And it makes some really interesting points. Okay, who's winning the war in Ukraine depends on who's doing the talking. And propagandists understand this. I did my master's thesis on the Nazis, and in that I read Joseph Goebbels' diaries, and I see a lot of parallels between particularly what Russia's doing and what was going on with the way that Goebbels processed things. And you see it to some degree by Westerners who are unwilling to triangulate and hear different perspectives. Okay, authoritarian Russia cannot be trusted with the facts. That is true. They can't be. They'll make up their facts, they'll prosecute people and put people in jail for 15 years if they disagree with a party line, up to 15 years. The liberal West inspires greater credibility. Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu said all warfare is based on deception. Neither side should be trusted to reduce the fog of war because both are fully engaged in psychological warfare, which is key to winning the overall war in Ukraine. That's a really interesting statement. We're fighting. Fighting is taking place on various levels. There's the kinetic war, there's a psychological war, there's an economic war, there's a political war. It's all together, and you have to understand that that's how this is going. And this is why what I'm about to say about Amnesty International is important. Both sides are propagating their own selective facts. Both sides need to up the ante in order to harden public resolve behind their goals, which thus far have excluded any serious effort toward diplomatic solution. Russia hopes to degrade the morale of Ukrainian resistance and the West in general. The U.S. wants to shore up Ukraine and European enthusiasm for a winnable war. The Russian media has little or no choice but to parrot the official line. I mean, like I said, you can get up to 15 years for speaking out against the war. We had the protester who had the "Stop the War" sign in her hands. She just got a second fine for putting something on her social media. Okay, the article goes on. The Russian media has little or no choice but to parrot the official line. Western media has a choice, but it chooses to trust NATO and Pentagon briefs and reports. And so a good journalist should triangulate. The Western and especially Anglo-American media seems to suffer from short, or should I say selective memory, forgetting about, say, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, because the government has lied about things, not told the entire truth or shaded it or whatever. It's no surprise that governments, whether autocracies or democracies, lie about wars for tactical or strategic reasons. In fact, there's a fancy name for it: stratagem, which means to deliberately send untrue signals to unsettle the enemy and reassure its own side. Respected American and British journalists exhaust synonyms of fascist, evil, and dangerous to describe Putin with little or no attempt to balance or be objective. One is inclined to believe that Western media has largely been enlisted by NATO's crusade against Putin's Russia until victory. Now, there's a reason that it feels like that, and part of it is because you see this what feels like unprovoked aggression. Maybe Russia feels provoked, but it's clearly a one-sided aggression. It's not like the Ukrainians were trying to go over the Russian border to go attack Russia. Okay, NATO's ultimate objective is to defeat Russia, to deter China from following in its footsteps. It's betting that Russia will crack in Ukraine just as the Soviet Union imploded after a decade-long war against the U.S.-supported uprising in Afghanistan. 5 months, the Ukrainians have killed more Russians than 10 years in Afghanistan. But then again, Ukraine is no Afghanistan, not in any relevant way, and Russia does not view it as a disposable geopolitical asset, and therein lies the rub. Okay, now, what is RT, Russian Today? It's Russian television, right? If you can watch this live here, Russia Today, what are they saying about this Amnesty International report? Okay, well, here's what they're saying. Ukrainian forces appear to have a pattern of placing troops and military vehicles in residential areas because it's based on this research that Amnesty International conducted between April and July in the east of Ukraine. Now, the misery of this is that Amnesty International report will be parroted almost word for word from what RT says in Islamic, Indian, African news services all across the world. They're going to carry this. We have documented a pattern of Ukrainian forces putting civilians at risk and violating the laws of war when they operate in populated areas. Being in a defensive position does not exempt the Ukrainian military from respecting international humanitarian law. Now, notice what they're cherry picking from this document. Moscow claims never target civilian sites, contrary to the accusations coming from Kyiv. Now, so that's what they're using from this Amnesty International report. And let's look at another RT article. Kyiv blasts Amnesty International report on Ukraine, risking civilian lives. That Ukraine that violates humanitarian laws is unfair, says the minister. Amnesty International report that blames Kyiv for placing its military assets in schools and residential areas, violating humanitarian law and putting civilians at risk. They quote Kaluba, and I'm going to quote him a little bit later, so I'm not going to do it right now. But I understand that they're saying there's both sides, but that's not really fair. He's saying Amnesty should primarily focus on what Russia is doing to Ukraine, is what he's arguing. But they go on and talk about the report. In 22 of the 29 schools visited by Amnesty between April and July, the humanitarian rights group said it found evidence of current or prior military activity. Now, it sounds like they're holding little kids up against the wall and shooting from behind them and saying, don't shoot at us because we have a little kid here. You're going to be an aggressor. It's not like that. The schools are empty. Maria Zakharova, Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman, the NGO said the NGO's report not only confirmed what Moscow has known for a long time. We have been talking about this constantly, calling the actions of the Ukrainian armed forces and the tactics of using civilians as a human shield. But they're not using them as a human shield. They're fighting from defensive positions wherever they can find them because they're being attacked. So, what's the actual report? And you'll see the bias in the report itself. Here's the Amnesty International report, and I'm going to just go through this. Ukrainian forces have put civilians in harm's way by establishing bases and operating weapon systems in populated residential areas, including schools and hospitals. They sometimes can't choose the ground on which they fight, so this is a little unfair to start with. Such tactics violate international humanitarian law and endanger civilians as they turn civilian objects into military targets. To the degree that they knowingly or willfully do that, yes, that is correct. However, you can't always choose. If somebody wants to fight, they can choose the ground on which they want to fight you. Being in defensive position does not exempt the Ukrainian military from respecting international humanitarian law. Okay, now part of the problem with this is that the report is only about Ukraine. It's not about Russia. If they wanted to be fair and even-handed and not show a bias, they would say, here's a report that talks about fighting tactics that endanger civilians in Ukraine. Here's what the Ukrainians are doing. Here's what the Russians are doing. But they're not doing that. They're only talking about the one side about Ukraine. And so it's going to get played. The propaganda value of it for Russia is immense. And so if you have the military kinetic war, you have the propaganda war, you have the economic war, the political war. This is a huge propaganda piece for Russia that they're going to spin out, as you just saw in RT. In certain other locations, which Amnesty International concluded that Russia had committed war crimes, including some of the areas of Kharkiv, and the organization did not find evidence of Ukrainian forces located in civilian areas unlawfully targeted by the Russian military. That was some gibberish that said Russia has targeted civilians in other places where the Ukrainian military wasn't. They could have said that more clearly, and I don't know, I can't understand why they didn't. The most residential areas where soldiers located themselves were kilometers away from the front lines. Viable alternatives were available that would not endanger civilians, such as military bases. Sure, military bases, fine, go fight there. Or densely wooded areas nearby. Now, why would you not go to a densely wooded area? Because a building provides protection. A tank is shooting at you. The wooded area isn't going to provide nearly the protection that the building will provide. Now, if you want to understand more about this, this is my page. If you go to Professor Gerdes Daily Updates on Ukraine, you can see all these daily updates, but I want you to focus on one. An urban warfare expert tells us how to defend a Ukrainian city. This guy here he was at West Point, and he's like one of the world's top experts on urban warfare. Well, what do you do when you're in urban warfare? Well, you defend from a position of strength, and a building is a position of strength. A wooded area is not. So you want to get the civilians out, but yeah, you're going to need to use the buildings. Okay, launching strikes from populated civilian areas. Survivors and witnesses of Russian strikes in the Donbas, Kharkiv, and Mykolaiv regions told Amnesty International researchers that the Ukrainian military had been operating near their homes around the times of the strikes. Well, I mean, they have to. I mean, that's just part of the reality they have to get around. I don't understand why our military is firing from the cities and not from the field, said another resident. Because there's no protection in the field. They don't want to die just like you don't want to die. In Bakhmut, several residents told Amnesty International that the Ukrainian military had been using a building barely 20 meters across the street from a residential high-rise building. On 18 May, a Russian missile strike in the front of the building partly destroyed 5 apartments and damaging nearby buildings. Okay, and that has happened. That's tragic. But that does not mean that the Russians wouldn't still destroy the city as they did in Mariupol, as they did in the east, in the Donetsk and Luhansk, because their doctrine is destroy the place and then move in where it's safe. So, or hitting a theater, hitting a shopping mall, hitting a high-rise building where there were no fighters, those kind of things. I mean, it's a rail station where there are just people trying to escape. That's just terrorism. Okay, military bases and hospitals, they should never be in hospitals. There's not even any question about it. Just like the nursing home incident, they should never have been there. Okay, military bases in schools. Okay, now the article made it sound like they're using human shields of little children. They're not. The schools have been closed. Schools have been temporarily closed to students since the conflict began. Now, in at least 3 towns after Russian bombardment of the schools, Ukrainian soldiers moved to other schools nearby, putting the surrounding neighborhoods at risk of similar attack. They have to go somewhere. Why a school as opposed to a house? They're really strongly well constructed. So that's what's going on there. That's why they're using it as a base so they have some protection. International humanitarian law does not specifically ban parties to a conflict from basing themselves in schools that are not in session. However, militaries have an obligation to avoid using schools that are near houses or whatever. And these schools were not in session. That's the trick here. They're not in session. So they're using the strongest protection that they can. It's like creating a fort somewhere, right? The strongest protection they can to hunker down. Okay? If they do so, they should warn civilians and, if necessary, help them evacuate. To the degree that they can, I'm pretty sure that they were not trying to get more people killed on the Ukrainian civilian side, but I don't see the balance in this presentation. The Safe Schools Declaration, an agreement to protect education amid armed conflict, which allows parties to make use of abandoned or evacuated schools only where there is no other viable alternative. And if they just deem that there's no viable alternative, there's no viable alternative. Now, they talk for a paragraph or two about indiscriminate attacks by Russian forces, but it's clearly not balanced. They talked about cluster munitions. The Ukrainian military's practice of locating military objectives within populated areas does not in any way justify indiscriminate Russian attacks. But the Russians were indiscriminately attacking, whether the Ukrainian military was there or not. The movie theater, the mall, the high-rise apartment complexes that were in the middle of nowhere, not in the middle of the fighting at all. They're like way inland, and they'd still shell them or send missile rocket attacks at them. Like, the Russians don't care. But we're not talking about that, except for a couple of paragraphs. So this doesn't excuse it, but the Ukrainians shouldn't do this. Okay, military should never use hospitals and engage in warfare, yes, and should only use schools and civilian homes as a last resort when there are no other viable alternatives. Right, we know that. So, all that to say, this does not really smack of balance, and that's why it's hot. Now, listen to the other side. We already talked about RT and their presentation, so let's go to the other side now. Here's Interfax Ukraine. Reznikov attempts to equalize Russian aggression and Ukrainian self-defense. Evidence of a loss of adequacy. So this is the Ukrainian defense minister. He's pretty hot about this. And he's saying the only reason why hundreds of thousands of our civilians are still alive is the selfless, heroic actions of the Ukrainian defense forces. Now, if I was sitting in his spot, I'd be hot too, because this is, remember, there's a hot war, there's a propaganda war, there's an economic war, there's a political war, there's even Russian bots on the internet. So there's all these different levels of warfare, and Amnesty International has just handed a huge morale victory to the Russians by putting out this particular piece. He goes on. The Russians have already used all types of weapons against the civilian population, except nuclear, and the Russians commit mass killings, prisoners of war. The Russians massively rape women, children, maim, rob, destroy all living things. And he's not wrong about this. This is all verifiable stuff. Any attempts to question the right of Ukrainians to resist genocide, to protect their families and homes, to protect their lives, the lives of their children, to resist the actions of the Russian Federation is a terrorist state as a terrorist state is a perversion. Now, let me use that as an example. If somebody breaks into my home and I use a particular tactic to stop them, whatever the particular tactic is, I choke them. They have a right not to be choked. Well, you know what? If they break into my home trying to harm my wife and child, I'm gonna choke them out, and that's what's gonna happen. So it's like you're saying, well, you can't do this. Again, it's just not fair to say what the aggressor is doing is to make a parallel between the aggressor and the victim here. Let me go on. I keep belaboring this. Kaluba, this is the Foreign Ministry Affairs. He was quoted a little bit earlier. He said, "I, like you, have seen the statement of Amnesty International. I am just as outraged by it as you are. I consider it unfair. This behavior by Amnesty International is not about finding and bringing the truth to the world, but about creating a false balance between the criminal and his victim." And that's what I was just saying, right? You can't, this equivalency is just, it's not okay. Between a country that kills civilians by the hundreds and thousands and destroys cities, territories, a country that defends itself by saving its people and the entire continent from invasion. Okay, so that's what's going on there. I just have a few last little bits here. Um, in other news, Zelensky urges China's president to help end the war in Ukraine, and it's really interesting how he's doing this. He's talking to the South China Morning Post, and he's appealing to China like, I'd like to talk to him directly. We talked about a year and a half ago, and then he says that he understood China wished to maintain a balanced attitude towards the war, but he stressed that the conflict began with Russia. Okay, but then he said the Russians are the invaders. This is war on our territory. They came to invade. Listen to this. This is beautiful. China, as a big and powerful country, could come down and sort of put the Russian Federation in a certain place. Like, he's appealing to them in a very interesting way. Zelensky told the SCMP that he believed China had the economic clout to pressure Putin to end the war. I'm confident, I'm sure, that without the Chinese market for the Russian Federation, Russia would be feeling complete economic isolation. And he's not wrong. They would be feeling terrific economic isolation if the Chinese weighed in on that side. Zelensky also was talking to the African media. Now, remember, Lavrov was recently going on this charm offensive in Africa, in Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia and somewhere else. I can't remember, but he was like, and he kept talking about how, the West, those colonizers. Well, Russia's been colonizing too, but they tried to colonize their neighbors. They didn't colonize in Africa, but he kept bringing this colonizing up. Zelensky actually called him out on it. Zelensky called Russia's war against Ukraine colonial. This is language that the Africans understand because they reject this whole colonizing kind of idea. Russia is a colonizer who wants to destroy our state. He called on journalists to convey to every family on the African continent that we are a peace-loving people. We're not different from you. We have the same values. And then he noted that Russia invests in the African continent less than 1% of all investments in Africa. This is their belief in the future of the African continent. They're not really invested in you. And so I think it was just a beautiful rebuff to what Lavrov was just doing. And that Lavrov was making lots of play, getting lots of press in the African news because of his goodwill tour and how much he was talking about how the West is these colonizers, and we're not like that. We're for your sovereignty and your self-determination. Okay, so that was their answer. Last article, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, is still unable to get to the prisoners of war that were blown up in Olivinka. Now, it's still an open question. Who did the blowing up? Was it US-made HIMARS, and it doesn't look like that from what I can tell, or was it maybe an inside job, a false flag operation in order to blame the Ukrainians for this? I can't say because I don't have the definitive facts, but it looks really sketchy. Okay, our offer to donate supplies remains unanswered, the committee said. We've already have the medical, forensic, and humanitarian teams working in the vicinity, so they can do it. But as of yet, we've not been granted access to the POWs affected by the attack. Now, why wouldn't you grant those POWs access to the International Red Cross? We're not even talking about the UN, who doesn't have access to forensically determine what happened. Just the International Red Cross, who are are, like, unlike Amnesty International, not biased. They go anywhere just to preserve life. So, okay, that's all that I have for today. It is Thursday, the 4th of August. Come back tomorrow and we'll talk again.